My name is Jonathan Nevill and I'm talking to you from Australia. Today I'm going to be talking about the protection of freshwater biodiversity. Now, two terms, biodiversity, that term has come to mean all living things. Ecosystem, an ecosystem can be defined as a semi-enclosed, definable area where nutrients and energy is recycled. An ecosystem usually has a characteristic, it has a characteristic assembly of plants, animals, microbes, fungi. Now let's talk about the high-level policy that guides all conservation efforts to protect biodiversity, not just in Australia but across the world. Now, the two most important international conventions, and these are conventions that have been sponsored by the United Nations, and their ongoing implementation is monitored and managed by the United Nations. Now, the 1972 Ramsar Wetlands Convention and the 1992 Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, both of those conventions have received widespread ratification from countries around the world, including Australia. Before we leave the subject of international conventions, it's important to know that there are no penalty provisions. So even though Australia signed up to these conventions, if we're not meeting our obligations, there are no there's no policing, no independent policing, and there are no failure provisions. So the reports, the way the United Nations monitors a country's implementation of the conventions is through government reports. Now, the governments themselves prepare these reports and submit them to the United Nations secretariats for the various conventions. Now, this is like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. So international conventions have those two big drawbacks. There's no penalty provisions, and the accounting is done by the fox itself. Now, freshwater ecosystems. You'll often, when scientists talk about freshwater ecosystems, you'll hear the words lentic and lotic. Lentic ecosystems are still water ecosystems, like lakes and ponds and wetlands. Lotic waters are actively moving, ecosystems based on actively moving water, rivers and streams and so on. It's also important to recognise that both lentic and lotic ecosystems can exist out of sight, below the surface of the ground where humans live. And the fauna that lives in those aquifer ecosystems, they're very dark. Often the fauna have lost the ability to see. Often the fauna are very small because the ecosystems themselves are usually formed by cracks in the rock, in the aquifer itself. Water will flow either very, very slowly or much faster through these cracks. And the fauna in these ecosystems depend largely for their energy and nutrient supply on debris carried into the aquifer from the recharge points. Now, being rather inaccessible, the fauna of these dark, strange places is not well known or well appreciated, but there are some very ancient forms of life in these underground ecosystems, and they're easily damaged. Now, before we go any further, it's essential to underline the point that surface ecosystems are linked with groundwater. So where does the water in a river come from? It's not raining most of the time, and yet the river flows most of the time. The river is fed by groundwater, and it's the same for lakes. So the lakes are fed by groundwater. Now, it's also important to recognise that the catchments, the surface catchment, which you can see if you look at a topographic map, the surface catchment may not be the same as the aquifer catchment. The aquifer recharge points may be well out of sight and not understood unless you can understand the geology of that area, geology and geomorphology. Now, just a little example of the way these systems can be misunderstood. Until 1999, when Tasmania, that's where I live, Tasmania in Australia, until 1999, Tasmania had two pieces of legislation, the Water Act and the Mines Act. Now, amongst other things, the Mines Act delegated power to control the extraction of water, underground water, to the Mines Department, at the same time as the Water Act delegated the power to control extraction and use of surface water to the Department of Water. Doesn't make sense because the two things are interconnected. It's the same water. Now, I want to stress that those two conventions that we talked about establish the cornerstones or principles of protecting biodiversity. The cornerstone is that you need representative reserves. You need to protect representative examples of every major ecosystem type, right? And they need to be able, those reserves need to be able to exist in the long term. So they need to be permanently reserved, and they need to be large enough to be viable in the long term. Now, size also has another advantage. We still don't understand a lot about many ecosystems. We can use size of the reserve as a way of protecting things we don't understand. So where we are going to protect something, whether it'll be a terrestrial national park or some kind of reserve to protect a lake or a river, we need permanent protection, we need large protection, and in the case of freshwater ecosystems, we need to have controls over the catchment. We don't necessarily need to own the catchment, In many cases that would be impossible. But we need to have controls on the land use in both the aquifer catchment and the surface catchment if we're going to protect freshwater biodiversity. You can't just put a fence around the lake and hope that that's going to protect the fauna and flora of the lake. It's not going to work because the lake depends on being fed, and that water is coming from the surrounding catchments. Okay, now to establish representative areas, we need to know what's there. A good example is what was done by the Land Conservation Council in Victoria. Now, Victoria is one of Australia's 8 provinces. Here they're not called provinces, they're called states and territories. So the states are West Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And the smaller territories are the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. Now I call them provinces because that word province is widely used around the world. So the way government works in Australia is we have 3 levels of government. We have a national level, which we call federal or Commonwealth, and then we have the provincial level, and then underneath that we have the local level, and sometimes that's called a shire council or a city council. Now, it's under the Australian Constitution, most of the responsibility for natural resource management rests at that middle level with the provinces. Okay, let's get back to Victoria. So Victoria created a body called the Land Conservation Council and charged that body with identifying all the important areas of the state that needed some sort of special protection. So the LCC surveyed the whole state in various parcels, and one of its reports was about freshwater, about rivers and streams and wetlands. Now, the LCC identified, it talked about threats, it talked about values, it talked about representation, it talked about the need to establish and protect representative examples of freshwater ecosystems. Now, the report was done over some years. It had public input, it had a lot of scientific input. It identified some rivers that were so badly degraded and under so much threat that protecting the ecosystems was impossible. However, the LCC did identify a suite of rivers, sometimes parts of rivers, which were very important from a biodiversity point of view and could be protected. The LCC recommended, now the LCC was an independent body, it's not a government controlled body, it was set up and funded to be independent. And it lasted through several different provincial governments. So the LCC was there for a long time, did a lot of good work. Now, the LCC recommended the creation of a River Protection Act. That recommendation was accepted and the Parliament created the Victorian Heritage Rivers Act. And it contained provision to allow controls to be put over the catchments to protect the waters and thus the living ecosystems in the waters. Now, the sad part about that, that was required to meet Australia's international obligations under the Ramsar Convention. But the sad part about that act is that it was never seriously implemented. The provincial government, the Victorian government, never allocated anything like enough money to properly implement that act. And that situation exists to this day. Now going back 20 years, I was part of a group of scientists who tried to raise awareness of Victoria's failures to meet the provisions of the Ramsar Convention. We presented papers, we published papers in journals, we went to conferences, we highlighted Victoria's failures, but the government ignored us. And the issue there is that fish don't vote. Okay, so Victoria still has that act, it still exists, but effectively useless. Now, at the time that our team of scientists started looking at these issues, we looked at Canada, where it has a Heritage Rivers Act, and we looked at the United States of America, where it has a Wild Rivers Act. And those acts, Canada and USA, they had some successes. But again, in terms of protecting representative examples of all major ecosystem types, all major freshwater ecosystem types, they don't work very well. And again, it's a lack of political will and funding. But they're there, and they could be built on. And that's the same as the Victorian Heritage Rivers Act. It's still there, and it could be built on today, if we got enough community awareness to generate political commitment. Problem is, as I said, fish don't vote. Now, our group saw an opportunity in Queensland where the state government was amenable to the idea of protecting rivers, particularly rivers. So for over a period of years, a lot of survey work was done, a lot of good scientific work was done. Now, Queensland has hundreds of rivers. We recommended that the most important, from a biodiversity point of view, of those rivers be protected. And in fact, the Queensland government put in place an act called the Wild Rivers Act, same name as the one used in the USA. Now, it went further than that. The government funded implementation of protective measures. So it passed the act, and it funded a program to implement the measures. Now, the state government was there for two seasons of Parliament. In other words, each season here in Australia is 3 or 4 years. So it was there for 7 or 8 years. And that act started to work. It started to protect those few very highly significant rivers. But the catchment controls didn't please some of the big players in agriculture, in industry. Cattle graziers, for instance, weren't allowed to build in-stream dams on those protected areas, and that was to protect the right, if you like, of fish passage. Now, only a few of the big players got upset, but they were enough to persuade the incoming government, that's the third term, which was an ultra-right government. They persuaded that government to repeal the act and remove all the protection programs and controls. Now, as an aside, I'll mention that Australia has a political system based on two very big players, the Labor Party, which is right-wing, and the Liberal Country Party coalition, which is even more right-wing, extreme right-wing, almost extreme. Certainly there's some members in that group that are extreme. We have a lot of moderate players and a lot of small players, but they're the two big ones, the Labor Party and the Country Liberal Party. So it was the Country Liberal Party that destroyed Queensland's Wild Rivers Act. Now, let's just go over some of the threats that are important. The three big groups of threats are water over-extraction, water pollution, and physical damage, physical alteration to the habitat itself. So let's just think about these issues, and while I'm going through them, think in your head about what measures could be used to moderate or control these threats. Now in Australia we've got some farming industries like cotton farming, wet rice farming, that use a great deal of water, over extraction. We've got some big industries that where they operate, they use huge amounts of water, over extraction. Urban areas, although Australia is not densely populated, urban areas and the need to supply water to those urban areas is impacting on our systems, our freshwater systems. Mining too can result in over-extraction. In some cases the mine can't operate unless the aquifer water levels are reduced. It's physically, we don't have machines that can mine underwater. So a big mine has to, if there's water there, it's got to be removed and dumped somewhere. So we've got water extraction from mining, also some kinds of treatment. For example, one of the ways of treating gold is to use mercury. Mercury is toxic. Toxic waste from mining operations can be dumped back into aquifers. You also get acid effects as well. Now, there's also the issue of mining and aquifer damage, and I'll handle that when we get down to physical alterations. So we've got over extraction all around the world, a huge danger to ecosystems, particularly ecosystems like the underground ecosystems that I've been talking about. People don't care about them at all. At least fish have a few advocates, but you get very few members of the public saying, let's protect our underground, our aquifer ecosystems. Again, fish don't vote, that's the problem. Now, agriculture can be a major source of aquifer pollution. Now, it's usually, if a farmer is going to apply fertiliser to his land, whether it be for cropping or dairy farming, it's easier to apply a bit too much than not enough. It's better for the environment to apply just under the optimum level, not enough, but it's easier for the farmer to apply too much because the cost he pays is relatively low. So fertilisers gradually enter the aquifers, and from the aquifers they gradually enter the lakes and rivers and streams. Lake Taupo in New Zealand is a good example. There's been over-application of agricultural fertilisers in the wider catchment of Lake Taupo for decades, and for decades the government has been ignoring the warnings of scientists. So now Lake Taupo, which used to be pure and clean and clear, has this enormous body of groundwater, polluted with nitrogen, phosphorus, moving slowly but unstoppable towards the lake. You've also got industrial waste in some places. From the mining industry's point of view, from any industry's point of view, if the government allows it, it's going to be much cheaper to dump its toxic waste straight into an aquifer, straight into the ground. So again look, industry is out there to make a profit. Unless you have proper control by governments, that waste will be dumped into the groundwater. Now let's talk about physical threats. So dams can stop fish passage. There are many aquatic creatures, not just fish, that need to move up and down the stream, the river. Here in Australia, eels, for example, spawn in the ocean and move back to the streams. In America, salmon spawn in the rivers and move back to the ocean. You've got a lot of movement up and down the rivers and streams. So what happens if you put an in-stream dam rather than an off-stream dam? It blocks fish passage. Now you can use fish ladders, but they're always, to some extent, ineffective. So the blocking of movement is an important issue. Now with let's take cattle access to rivers. If you allow unfettered cattle access to rivers, they'll destroy the riverbank vegetation, they'll pollute the streams and rivers with their own fecal material and also with the sediment they disturb. And in fact, the loss of riverbank vegetation too will directly affect the ecosystem of that freshwater river, lake, stream. Mining, this is an issue. A mine can connect different aquifers. Aquifers depend on the rock strata, the geology. Now there may be more than one aquifer there in an area, and if there's two or more aquifers, they may have different catchments. They may travel through different rock types. Some may be salty, some may not. So you're going to have aquifers of different quality, carrying different quality waters. Now, a mining operation can connect those aquifers in a way which will be detrimental to whatever fauna is living in the aquifers. And very often, in terms of environmental impact, before the mine is allowed to proceed, these issues are not properly studied. Okay, so it's really important to recognise that freshwater ecosystems do not look after themselves. It's really important to understand the reasons why we try and protect representative samples of every major ecosystem type. And for freshwater, it's really important to understand that the freshwater ecosystems are connected to their catchments. You can't protect a river without protecting the catchments. Now, you don't have to own the catchment, but you do have to put controls on land use. Okay, now, before finishing, I'll mention this book. Here in Australia, we had a society which then was called the Australian Society for Limnology, limnology being the study of fresh waters. That society is now the Australian Society for Freshwater Sciences, so a broader scope. But this work was done under the auspices of that society. It's a scientific society. So a lot of people contributed, a lot of people reviewed the material, and the scope of the material extends beyond Australia. It extends to discuss a whole lot of general principles which apply to any place in the world, any country in the world where you're really trying to protect freshwater ecosystems. The book is no longer available in hard copy format, but it's freely available as a download from the Australian Freshwater Sciences site, although I haven't checked that. It's certainly available from my own site, which is called onlyoneplanet.com, and I'll give you the exact link in the description of this video. But there it is. You can download it for free. It applies really across the world to any country which is seriously interested in protecting freshwater biodiversity. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you at the next video.